Souvenir King of the Australian Infantry Force. In the National War Memorial, Canberra, is an enlarged photograph which carries the inscription Souvenir King of the AIF. It shows a bulky, tough-looking Australian private wearing a German pork pie forage cap and squatting among a hoard of treasures souvenired or scrounged at Polygon Wood in 1917. One of the most famous photographs of World War I, it infuriated the Kaiser. He publicly denounced the subject as typical of the barbarian Australians on the Western Front. To any German soldier who got this Australian savage, dead or alive, Kaiser Wilhelm personally promised a substantial wad of marks as a reward. The money was never earned. The Souvenir King, Private John Barney Hines, was wounded 5 times, but seemed almost indestructible. One of the toughest daredevils the Australian Army ever produced, he was recognised as the bad boy of the first AIF in France. Oblivious to rules and discipline, he was still a legendary fighting machine, reputed to have more dead Germans to his credit than any other Australian soldier. His courage and single-handed feats of daring would have earned a chestful of decorations, but for his misdemeanours that filled his paybook with red ink. Despite his reputation overseas as a typical Australian, John Hines was born in Liverpool, England in 1873 of Irish parents. At 14 he enlisted in the army, but was soon hauled home again after his mother located him and revealed his age to the authorities. Hefty, hard-bitten young Barney waited 2 years and was then off again, this time to the Navy. He served in the Boxer Rebellion in China in 1894, unsuccessfully joined the gold rush to the Klondike 3 years later, and went through the Boer War in South Africa as a scout with various British units. In 1904 he turned up in the United States. He wandered to South America seeking a fortune in mining ventures. Gold lured him to New Zealand before World War I, where he expended a lot of sweat for little return at a mine on Big Barrier in Hauraki Gulf. In Australia, on the outbreak of war, Barney Hines, then in his 40s, tried to enlist but was rejected on medical grounds. He continued to haunt enlistment centres and was finally accepted. Private Barney Hines arrived in France in 1916 as a reinforcement for the 45th Battalion. Dubbed Wild Eyes by his digger comrades, Big Barney Hines and his escapades soon became famous. He generally disdained to use his .303 rifle and invariably went into action with 2 sandbags stuffed with hand grenades clutched in his ham-like hands. His fighting ability was recognised by his officers, although they despaired of ever turning him into a trained and disciplined soldier. The OC, Lieutenant Colonel A.S. Tubby Allen, had the brainwave of attaching the big fellow to a Lewis machine gun. Barney was entranced by its spraying power as soon as he was shown how to use it. "This thing'll do me," he growled, in his familiar guttural voice. "You can hose the bastards down." Generally, however, he remained faithful to his beloved Mills bombs, and hauled along a bag of them wherever he went. Later promoted Major General, Tubby Allen always had a soft spot for the incorrigible Barney Hines. "I always felt secure when Wild Eyes was about," he once said, "a tower of strength in that line. I don't think he knew what fear was, and he naturally inspired confidence in officers and men. With his bombs, Hines liked to prowl about on his own, collecting prisoners almost as enthusiastically as he did souvenirs. His record bag occurred one day near Octagon Trench when, out in the front as usual, he became annoyed at sniping fire directed at him from a German pillbox. Hines charged the small fort and, screaming abuse, flabbergasted the Germans inside by dancing about on the concrete top, daring them to come out. When they did not comply, he jumped down in front again and lobbed a couple of hand grenades through the gun opening. 63 Germans who survived decided they had had enough. They emerged sheepishly, contributed their quota of souvenirs, badges, watches and money, and were herded back to the Australian lines as prisoners by a triumphant Barney Hines. On another single-handed foray at Zonnebeck, Hines discovered a battered German dressing station. He crept up to investigate and found the German occupants were all dead. A doctor stood stiffly upright by a table. A shell splinter had pierced his heart. He keeled over like a statue when Barney tapped him on the shoulder. There were 6 other dead Germans strewn around. The only life in the charnel house was a wounded British Tommy lying on a stretcher on the floor. He had missed the sudden barrage that had wiped out the standing Germans. Barney Hines boldly shouldered the wounded man in an effort to get him back, but he died before they had gone 50 yards. After burying him, Hines scrambled back to the dressing station. Relieved of his burden, his hands were then free to carry a few tempting souvenirs he had noted. Barney Hines was already known far and wide as the Souvenir King. When an official army photographer took the famous picture at Polygon in 1917 that so incensed the Kaiser. The jewellery he collected was portable and easily disposable, but he continued hoarding cumbersome souvenirs. At Villers-Bretonneux, he somehow collected a piano and toted that around with him for a few days, until he finally and reluctantly gave it away. At Corby, he turned up with a grandfather clock. Its loud chiming, however, could be heard by the enemy and attracted so much unwanted shell fire that his comrades disposed of it with a hand grenade. Barney was, of course, absent at the time on one of his regular forays in search of liquid refreshment. In Armentières one day, he made a haul of a keg of Bass beer. Too big even for Barney Hines to shoulder, he started to roll it over the couple of miles to his battalion. On the way he had words with some inquisitive military police. There and then Barney sat down with a few helpers who soon appeared, and they disposed of the contents in record time. At Amiens he had visions of making an historic haul when the Australians arrived and found the beautiful cathedral town deserted. For once Barney Hines scorned his quota of easily obtained souvenirs. Instead, he disappeared after bigger game. No one saw him again until a squad of British military police surprised him in the strong room of the Bank of France, with millions in loot neatly packed in bags. The British did not handle Barney Hines too gently. He naturally retaliated and remembered no more until he recovered consciousness in a cell. Hines always claimed that he was then hauled out for questioning by an English colonel. On the way he recognised one of the MPs who had manhandled him in the bank. Before anyone could stop him, he grabbed one of the guards' rifles and jabbed the bayonet point into the overzealous provost. Probably the British brass hats were stumped as to how to handle such a stormy petrel. Before long, Barney was back safely with his unit, and boasting of the 14 days' pay which he said was all it cost him. Between such questionable episodes, wild-eyed Barney Hines was still performing valorous deeds in action that made his superiors forget all of his shortcomings. He destroyed an entire pillbox on his own one night with a few incendiary bombs, he called them eggs, that he nonchalantly tossed inside. Capturing 10 Germans, he lined them up in a shell hole and was preparing to collect his souvenirs when the late Lieutenant Tom Crook of the 45th arrived on the scene. Barney Hines was only worried that he might have to share his booty, not how to handle such a swag of prisoners. "You burl off and harpoon a bunch of your own," the private ordered, and because he was Barney Hines, the officer obediently made himself scarce. At Passchendaele, every man in a Lewis gun crew except Barney Hines was killed by a shell that made a direct hit on their nest. The Souvenir King was thrown 20 yards by the explosion, which ripped off the soles of his shoes. He crawled back, got the gun going again, and continued to use it alone until he fainted from a shrapnel hit in the leg. At Villers-Bretonneux, Barney discovered enough 1870 vintage champagne and tinned delicacies to put on a monster party for his mates. The party hardly broke up before Barney collected a bullet over the eye and a dose of poison gas. Despite his protests, he was shuttled off to a hospital at Etaples, nearly blind. German bombers came over a few nights later and scored direct hits on the hospital, causing 3,000 casualties. Despite another sliver of shrapnel in his heel, his gassed lungs, and his bad eye, Barney Hines hauled himself out of bed. All night, supported by a broomstick as a crutch, he helped to carry the wounded and dying out of the bombed shambles of the hospital. The war was over for Barney Hines after that. He came back to Australia with his body scarred and his health shattered. But he was still as rough, tough and undisciplined as the barbarian who roused the Kaiser's ire. Barney Hines adventured round the continent in the years between the wars, as a drover, shearer, prospector and timber cutter. On the outbreak of World War II, he tried to enlist in Sydney, but was rejected. A few days later he smuggled himself aboard a troop ship bound for the Middle East, but was discovered before she sailed and he was put ashore. In 1953, Barney Hines waxed indignant to reporters after receiving a letter from the Transport Department addressed to his executor. It referred to his recent death and requested return of a concession pass. Aged 80, Barney marched again on the following Anzac Day to publicly disprove the rumour that he was dead. Then in January 1958, the colourful and gallant old digger died in the Concord Repatriation Hospital.